Good evening, all. It's unusual honor and pleasure to speak in a place like this, which is sort of defining the Jewish history of Baltimore. This was, of course, as we all know, the first real synagogue over here, back in the time of the 1840s when Rabbi Rice was here fighting with his congregants, and site of many Jewish events and battles. And, of course, as we know later on, Shul went through all kinds of metamorphoses. It was a church for a while, and then it was once again repurchased by the Eastern European Jews when they flooded this neighborhood in the late 1800s. It became the Shomer Mishmeres Shul, so this is where Rabbi Schwartz, Olav Shalom, and many other famous people began. This is where TA started, those to use Baltimore talk. And they've changed here the decor, I can see, to take it away from what it looked like in the time of the Shomer Mishmeres, which after all was a Hasidic congregation. They had a Litvish rabbi, because they had a lot of common sense, but they took a Telzer, Rabbi Schwartz. But the decor looked different. However, they've changed it to, as far as I can tell, make it look like it did when the shul was first built in the 1840s, which has kind of like a church type of architecture over here, which bespeaks the desire of the new German Jews who had come to this country to fit into the American reality. Right? To fit into the American reality. It was mentioned before that there's a very interesting exhibit that I would recommend. Once you're here, take advantage of it. When this is over, before you go over for the main event, I'm talking about 80s food, but I'm not stupid, He says, before you go over there, if you walk downstairs, it's a little bit rickety, they have a nice little museum display with some of the fights that took place over here between the Orthodox and the Reform. I disagree with a lot of the interpretation, but that's not the point. And you can see the old mikveh that now has been in the newspapers that they discovered just don't fall in. And you can also see the old matzah factory, which I think goes back to the German times. And it's a rare opportunity. Most of us don't get the chance, or our schedules don't take us down here that often. And you can learn a little bit in terms of the reality of the Baltimore past. Having said that, let's get down to business. The title today, of course, had to do with battles 2,000 years ago. The Jews and the Egyptians over the Passover narrative. Alan and I came up with this title simply because we live, unfortunately, in a time in which some people are aware and active in it, the state of Israel. And many Jews are engaged in battles of legitimization and delegitimation, and struggles over the narrative of the state of Israel. Some people think that the creation of the state of Israel is a wonderful thing. Others will turn it into a terrible thing. And whose truth is it? Who's right? The future of Israel and so much else depends, whether we like it or not, in which narrative gets out there. And I'm not going to suggest that we're doing a great job. It defines the times in which we live, and it's one of the challenges that we, as American Jews, have to face up to. A number of years ago, 20 years ago, something like that, I got a phone call once, I've told this story before, from the Baltimore Sun. Before I was involved in the rabbi business, in the pulpit rabbi business, and a reporter called up from the Sun, and he said, this is Rabbi Katz here, I want to ask you a question about the date of Passover. I said, what's going on over here? Turns out it was around this time of the year, and they do, as the Baltimore Sun does, a piece on the holiday about Passover. And they were interviewing Rabbi Menachem Goldberger, whose shul is next to ours, and he was telling them all about Pesach. And then the reporter said, when did it take place? And he said, I don't know, ask David Katz. And so that's what he did. And he says, I'm calling from Baltimore, so what year was the Exodus of Egypt? And I already started getting it. I said, well, it depends how you reckon the chronology over here. If you go with the traditional rabbinic chronology, it's something like in the 1270s or whatever, something like that. If you go, on the other hand, there's a problem with the chronology. And he said, Rabbi, this is not science. This is journalism. Just give me a date. You understand? They just want a story. And it's interesting because if I would have gone into it, it would be kind of tricky. 3,000 years ago, 3,300 years ago, which is when we reckon the Exodus was, we have no historical evidence for this whatsoever. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, David, Shlomo, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, David, Solomon, all the other biblical characters. We have practically no historical evidence for. There's no historical evidence that I know of that the Jews were ever in Egypt, or let alone that there was a Moses, or all the rest of the story. What we do have historical evidence for is about 600 or 700 years later, something like that, Egyptians are angry at our story. And they say it's not true, they have a different story. When you get to the 3rd century, when a very famous Egyptian priest / historian, Manetho, was a leading figure in the Egyptian history. Can everybody hear me? Somebody want to help me with this? They can't hear. Is this better? Raise your hand if you can't hear me. Can you all hear me? I don't know what to do. They can't hear. Okay, I'm going to scream real loud. Can you all hear me now? Okay, we'll have to do like in Shul. Anyway, if you go back to the 3rd century, you find that this Egyptian fellow, who was an important priest, and was a high priest for the Egyptian king at that time, Manetho writes a history of Egypt, of ancient Egypt. We always think that the 200 BC was ancient time, but to them was the modern period. They were looking thousands of years before then. And he writes a famous work in Greek called the Egyptiakia, which is Egypt stuff. And he gives all the past dynasties of Egypt and the famous histories of the pharaohs and all that kind of business. And it's a very famous work, except it didn't survive. But it survived in certain fragments, mainly because in it he strongly attacks the Jews and the Jewish narrative of the Exodus of Egypt. And he says it's not true. And he says, we Egyptians have ancient records of what really happened. And this is very interesting because the Torah has a bunch of stories and other things like that, as we all know. Has, of course, the famous story, one of the most famous parts of the Torah is the story of the Exodus from Egypt. This is something that's captured the imagination of people around the world, Jewish or not. Baltimore was a slave town here 160 years ago, right? It's below the Mason-Dixon line. There were debates about slavery in the pulpit that I'm standing on at the moment, once upon a time. And the slaves in America, the black slaves in America, looked, for example, to the biblical story of Moses and Pharaoh and God's deliverance as a source of hope for them. This is true for peoples around the world. And so the very story of the Bible, the Old Testament, has captured the imagination of people, even if they're not Jewish. But you don't like it if you're an Egyptian. It is Torah is, among other things, a kind of anti-Egyptian document. Don't you agree? I mean, who's the good guy? Moses. Who's the villain? Pharaoh. Who are the nice people? The Hebrew slaves. Who are the oppressors? Who throw babies into water? Who tell the midwives to strangle the infants? If you're an Egyptian, you might be a little bit turned off by this. Get it? And they were. And so the result is that they say it's not true, and you guys are liars, and we have the actual truth, and here's the real story. And in their version, guess who's the hero, and guess who is the villain? You flip it. Of course, Pharaoh will be the hero, as you'll see in a second, and Moses, of course, will be the villain. And same thing across the board. Why does this appear in an Egyptian book for the first time in the 3rd century? I mean, Egyptian's been around for a long time. Why is this in 250 BC? Why isn't this in 350 BC, 450, 550, and all the rest of it? I mean, what do we know about this period in history that would make us understand this? Not too hard. One of the big stories that happens in Jewish history and in world history right around that time is the translation of the Bible for the first time into Greek. The Torah been around for a long time, is in Hebrew. When the Torah is in Hebrew, it can only be read by people who can read Hebrew, which is not many. Never was. On the other hand, a Greek in the 3rd century, that's after Alexander the Great, has conquered the Persian Empire, and his successors have established the famous Hellenistic empires of old. The king of the north, the king of the south, the way the book of Daniel puts it. The Seleucid Empire, for example, the Ptolemy Empire, Egypt, Syria. These were Greek cultural kingdoms. This is actually called in history the Hellenistic era. And if you put a book out in Greek, it could be read by people all across the world at that time, or across that part of the world. And so for the first time, the Jewish narrative is out there for everyone to read. Okay? In the 300s, Alexander the Great had conquered, as we all know, this great Persian Empire, including Egypt. And then he died shortly after he triumphed. According to many sources, he just drunk too much at a party, but whatever the case is, he left it to his generals. Alexander was not Greek, he was Macedonian. He actually destroyed the Greeks. He crushed them. He and his father, Philip of Macedon, enslaved the Greeks. The famous Demosthenes of Athens, who wrote the Philippics, was always warning against Philip of Macedon, against his father. But in spite of that, Alexander was educated in the Greek language and Greek culture by Aristotle, and his successors pervade this kind of culture all throughout the world at that time, including Egypt. It's called the Hellenistic era because, I don't know if anybody remembers the news item a couple years ago, the Taliban in Afghanistan, not that long ago, dynamited, they blew up old Greek temples from Alexander the Great's time, a little afterwards, because they viewed them from the Islamic perspective as being pagan and therefore not worthy of being permitted to remain. That goes to show you how, if in Afghanistan, of all places, you had Greek temples and Greek buildings, it shows you how widely pervasive the Hellenistic and the Greek culture was in that era. Okay, so if you're putting the book out in Hebrew, the book that formerly was in Hebrew, now in the Greek, everybody can read the story people never heard about before. Why did the Greeks want the Bible translated into Greek? It's not clear. There are all kind of controversial stories connected with it. There are 2 famous tales, one in the Gemara in the Talmud, and one in the pseudepigrapha, as they call it in the Greek writings, both of which say that King Ptolemy II, who was a famous king once upon a time, he either forced a bunch of rabbis to show up in Egypt and translate it, or he invited them. According to the Talmud, he kind of forced them, put them in separate rooms, and tried to see if they would come up with different versions of it, according to a famous book called the Letter of Aristeas to Philocrates, which is, I know, a bestseller, but once upon a time was. Right? Well, it's on your pseudepigrapha shelf at Barnes & Noble. It's a wonderful story, though. The king of Egypt invites the wise men of Jerusalem to come to Egypt. He throws this huge banquet that goes for pages and pages as the king asked him, who is wise among the Jews? Who is considered truly wealthy or happy? Why do you guys not eat rabbits? Why do you guys not eat camels? What's all the strange things that you Jews do? And the rabbis give them answers one page after another. And when it's all over, they retire very happily to an island somewhere in Egypt. They write the Torah, translate it into Greek, and everybody's happy. So one version of the story is that it was a negative phenomenon. The other one is that it's a positive phenomenon. I know you'll be shocked to find that Jews are of 2 minds on anything. And indeed, in those days, the big question was, should you or should you not translate the Bible into another language? We have these issues today where should you translate the Talmud into another language? But they did it. Okay? And how and when and precisely when, we don't know with exactitude, but we know it happens around this time. And so now you're a Greek, a Syrian, a Babylonian intellectual, and you read this book for the first time, and you see there was this guy named Moses and this idiot named Pharaoh, and you know the story. Let my people go. Pharaoh said, I will not let them go. He said, yes, you will. And by the time it's over, he lets them go. He has to run in the middle of the night and tell Moses, please leave and pray for me on the way out. To even give their money to the Jews. If you're an Egyptian, particularly if you're an Egyptian aristocrat, a member of the middle class or upper class, which Manetho and others are, who made up this garbage? Right? This is an attack on Egyptianism and our culture, and it's totally wrong. And so, as I said, they produce, or he does, a counter-narrative, which he claims is based on ancient Egyptian records. This is the only non-biblical possible source of ancient records about Moses and the Israelites and things of that nature. But it's a different story. I'll read you a very brief version of this, and maybe a little bit later the way a Roman would put it out there. As he says over here, is Manetho tells the story of Osirseph. According to Josephus, and Josephus wrote a whole book attacking this. Manetho described Osirseph as a tyrannical high priest of Osiris at Heliopolis. He was an Egyptian priest. Pharaoh Amenhotep had a desire to see the gods. But in order to do so, he first had to cleanse Egypt of lepers and other polluted people. So the country is, as we say in Hebrew, tameh, is unclean. And so he collected them, set 80,000 of them to work in stone quarries, and confined them to Avaris, the capital city. So I guess he planned to kill them through hard labor. There, Osirseph became their leader, the leader in others of the lepers and of the unclean people. And he ordered them to give up the worship of the gods and to eat the meat of the holy animals. Because in Egypt, I'm sure many know this, the animals were worshipped, just about every animal. The Osirsephites then invited the Hyksos into Egypt. This was a foreign invading group. And together with their new allies, they drove the Pharaoh and his son Ramses into exile in Nubia and started a 13-year reign of religious oppression. In other words, religious oppression of the Egyptians. Towns and temples were devastated. The images of the gods were destroyed. The sanctuaries were turned into kitchens. The sacred animals were roasted over fires, until finally the Pharaoh and his son returned to expel the lepers and the enemy and the invaders and restore the old Egyptian religion. Towards the end of the story, Manetho, the author, tells us that Osirseph eventually took the name of Moses. Oh, so that's who he is. Moses is a renegade Egyptian priest. It's kind of true. Do you agree with that story? Well, it's interesting how it plays off the Jewish story. Was Moshe Rabbeinu, as Ellen said before, was Moses an Egyptian? Well, he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter. Did he have a Jewish education? Did he go to a yeshiva? Or was he raised in Pharaoh's palace? There are many Jewish traditions, by the way, in the Midrash that say that Moses was a famous Egyptian general and a hero before he switched his careers and became Jewish. In other words, returns to his people. And so the notion, especially as an Egyptian would tell it, of Moses being a renegade Egyptian, you can understand that. True? This business about the lepers and the others, that's very, very interesting. But the key point is that the Jews were not who they say they are, and the Egyptians didn't persecute them without reason, but rather, being naturally unclean and polluted and so forth, they constitute a menace to the rest of Egyptian society. And naturally, it was only prudent on the part of the Pharaoh to do something about it, especially since the gods told him to. Okay? This is a partial rendering of the story, but you know how it goes. You put a story out there, even if it's on the news, and by the time it's retold and retold and retold, you know, it picks up a life of its own. I'm sure we all know the game of whatever they call it at the party, where one says something and the other one, by the time you finish, it's not quite exactly what it was in the first place. We have a wonderful example of this in the Roman historian Tacitus. This book that I just mentioned with this story is written about 250 BCE or so. Keep that date in mind. It's floating out there, and it actually constitutes a competing narrative with the Chumash, with the Bible. We do know that the translation of the Torah into Greek had huge, perhaps unforeseen, consequences, because the fact that people who are not Jewish are now able to access, if they wish, the Bible, and even not the oral law, just the text of the Torah, triggered, among other things, a great wave of conversion to Judaism over the next centuries. I often like to remind people, if one went to a synagogue outside of Israel in the 200 BC, 100 BC, or the year 1, or year 100 even, I would bet you on a Saturday morning, one would find more people attending services who were not Jewish than were Jewish. After all, one does not have to be Jewish to enter a synagogue. We don't have anything to hide. Many people, we have lots of records of this, were interested in Judaism for a variety of reasons, one of which being that there was an intellectual crisis of paganism at that time, among many. The old religions weren't quite working. I'll return to that later. People were looking for something new. Many new ideas were popular out there. One of them, not the only one, but one of them was this religion called Judaism with these Bible stories. We know from the Talmud and other places that, what shall I say, the word conversion doesn't necessarily mean what it means today, that there's a formal process with a court and the halachic requirements. The Talmud says, somewhere in my house on Purim, we talked about this, the Talmud says that in the time of Purim, for example, the Talmud, I repeat, says in the time of Purim, many people declared themselves Jewish, just like that, and they're accepted. The final halacha is that they are considered Jewish. The technical term for this in Hebrew is gerim gerurim. And even in the Middle Ages, there are some opinions out there. And that's not what we do today, but I'm talking about the way it was once upon a time, where it was more fluid, and I'm sure there were a lot of different opinions upon it once upon a time, but it doesn't matter. The actual reality was that people showed up, and they said, we want to be part of this, and we declare ourselves part of this, and you had 100% Jews, meaning people who completely went into the new religion with all the requirements, 80%, 70%, 50%, 30%, and so forth. There were people who say, I like this Shabbos business and kosher, but the circumcision is not for me. And there are other people who said, I like Passover, but the Seder's really turn on, but Yom Kippur fasting is not for me. And you might say, this is not fair to pick and choose and all the rest of it. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong or fair. I'm saying that's what happened. And this is a result, clearly. This phenomenon existed throughout the Greco-Roman period. There's a result, clearly, of the translation of the Bible into Greek and the exposure of the stories and the lessons and the laws even that one finds there, expounded from the synagogue, as we're doing at this moment, by people called maturgamons and other things like that, which captured the imagination of many people. Princes, kings, and other aristocrats and nobles converted to Judaism during this period. These are all recorded, let alone commoners. And so, lots of people are hearing about the bad Egyptians. And lots of people, especially when it comes to Passover time, are saying, oh, the wicked Pharaoh and the good Jews and all that. And you can understand that the Egyptians don't like this at all. And one of the results is that Alexandria, which was the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt at that time, becomes the world center of intellectual anti-Semitism and the chief source, place where anti-Semitic literature and pamphlets are composed, some of which survive today and some do not. There's just a constant production of it. And there's no question that this is connected, as I say before, with the fact that if you're Jewish, what can I tell you? The Bible's not politically correct. They do criticize the Egyptians, and the Egyptians do not like that. Now, that means that if you're talking about the 200s, the 100s BCE, the hundreds, and all that time, there are two competing narratives battling for the attention of the world. They're just there. One is ours, one is theirs. One is the Jewish one, one is the Egyptian one. There's no question in my mind, I can't prove this, but I think that the composition of this institution that you and I call the Passover Seder, which has its origins in this period in history, is a result of this battle for narratives and which should get out there. Many know that according to the Torah, there's no such thing as a Seder. There's no such thing as 4 cups, 4 sons, the Manishtana, and all the rest of it. This came later. In spite of the fact it came later, the Mishnah and the rabbis are very careful to say every person has to have 4 cups. You have to give the poor, you have to sell your clothes even. You have to do whatever it takes to have the mitzvah of 4 cups of wine. In other words, you better be at that Seder and you better care. Why? It's a constant ideological battle going back and forth. Who's more successful? Don't know. I can tell you one thing. If we look at one of the most famous Roman intellectuals, historians of the late 1st century, in other words, 56 to 117 CE. So what is that? That's Tacitus. Anybody here have a classical education when they were in high school, had to read this kind of stuff, or in college? Tacitus is one of the most famous Roman historians, very good one too. And he's a Roman aristocrat. He doesn't know any Jews. They don't travel in his circles. He's a senator. What does he know about Jews? He knows the same thing about Jews as you probably know about the people, I don't know, in Ceylon or something like that. I mean, a little bit. And probably what you'll tell me is wrong. Because it's not something you just pick up rumors. And maybe today, with Wikipedia, it might be a little bit different world, but they're wrong too sometimes. And so, listen to this. Here's an educated guy. This is one of the most educated Romans who's writing one of the most distinguished works of classical literature. The histories and the annals of Tacitus are legendary and models of the classic culture. And he says over here, and you'll just find this interesting, mind you, this is written in the old-fashioned Latin, so the long, the old-fashioned sentences, two independent clauses connected by a semicolon, And he says, being now, he's talking about the war of the Romans against Jerusalem, Titus destroying the city of Jerusalem. And he says, being now about to relate the catastrophe of that celebrated city, it seems fitting I should unfold the particulars of its origins. In other words, who is Jerusalem? Who are these Jews anyway? The Jews, we are told, escaping from the island of Crete at the time when Saturn was driven from his throne by Jupiter, settled in extreme parts of Libya. Whoops. You're trying to tell me Gaddafi? No. Well, very interesting. It turns out there were Cretans. Of course, I don't mean that with an I, but an A. Every rumor has a source of truth, piece of truth in it. It's not the Jews that come from Crete, it's the Philistines, the Palestinians. The Philistines, we're told, in the Bible and in history, actually came from the island of Crete. And so he's a Roman, and he heard that somebody in Palestine over there, they all came from Crete, and who cares? The name is adduced as a proof. There's a mountain called Judea over there and all the rest of it. Others say that the population overflowing through Egypt in the reign of Isis, so that there was a certain element of the Egyptian population that was getting too many, was relieved by emigration into the neighboring countries under the conduct of Prince Jerusalem. So there's some truth to that. I mean, we believe that. Am I right or am I wrong? That the Jews once were in Egypt and they were overflowing. The Bible says that the Egyptians couldn't take it anymore. And then they left and they settled, not perhaps under the leadership of a guy named Jerusalem, but whatever. Many state that they are the progeny of the Ethiopians, who were impelled by fear and detestation to change their abode in the reign of King Cepheus. And the Ethiopian Jews claim that they're the oldest Jews. There are those who report that the Jews are a heterogeneous band from Assyria, or northern Iraq, a people who, being destitute of a country, made themselves masters of a portion of Egypt and subsequently settled in cities of their own in the Hebrew territories, bordering on Syria. Yeah, that's the Torah's version. Are we Iraqis? Abraham comes from southern Iraq, right or wrong. Ur Kasdim, Ur of the Chaldees. Arami Oved Avi. So that's who we are. So, rumors are flying. Very many authors agree in recording that pestilential disease, which disfigured the body in a loathsome manner, spreading over Egypt, Bacchus being the king, he repaired to the oracle of Jupiter Hammon in quest of a remedy. So there was what we call today a public health outbreak. Okay, we have some nurses here. And it's a public health menace. The Pharaoh naturally did what you do in those days. You don't go to the National Institute of Health, you go to the oracle of the gods. And he was directed to purify his kingdom and exterminate that race of men as being detested by the gods. And so all these dirty people and unhealthy people who are typhoid Marys have to be rounded up for the benefit of the community in a whole and exterminated. Now, they didn't have concentration camps 3,000 years ago, so it means you throw them out of the country and throw them into the desert. And a mass of people thus was searched out and collected together and were in a wild and barren desert abandoned to their misery. Interesting. When all the rest being bathed in tears and torpid with despair, Moses, one of the exiles, admonished them not to look for any aid from gods or men, being deserted by both, but to trust themselves to Moses as a heaven-commissioned guide by whose aid already they had warded off the miseries that beset them. So he basically said, you put me in charge, I'll get you guys out of here. They agreed, and they started a venturous journey, not knowing whither they went, and nothing distressed them so much as the lack of water. This is a theme throughout the Bible, correct? They're always complaining that there's no water. And now they lay stretched throughout the plains ready to expire. When a herd of wild asses, returning from pasture, went up a rock shaded with a grove. Moses followed them there, forming his conjecture by the herbage that grew in the ground, and he opened copious springs of water. This is their version of Moses hitting the rock and the water coming out. This was a relief, and pursuing their journey for 6 more days, they arrived in a land called Canaan, and they set themselves up, or they took possession of a country on the 7th day, where they built their city and dedicated their temple. Interesting. So the Jews didn't leave Egypt, they were thrown out. You know the old story. You didn't quit, I fired you. And why were they thrown out? Lepers, other loathsome, pestilential diseases, because you know who Jews are. Okay? And so it's not surprising. Actually, Pharaoh was doing the right thing. And these people had the strange luck that this Moses guy assumed control. They should have all just died in the desert from lack of water. But this guy found them some water in a rock, and they were able to get to their destination, take over another country. In order to bind the people to him for all time to come, Tacitus says, Moses prescribed to them a new form of worship and opposed to those of all the world besides. That the Jewish religion, this a Roman senator, is weird. Whatever is held sacred by the Romans with the Jews is profane, and what in other nations is unlawful and impure, with them is permitted. Now, Maimonides subscribes to this opinion of many of the rules in the Torah as well. The figure of the animal through whose guidance they slaked their thirst and were enabled to terminate their wanderings is consecrated in the sanctuary of their temple. So that means that in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, in the Holy of Holies, in Jerusalem, Tacitus is reporting to us, the Jews have a statue of a golden ass with a boy in it, a donkey. And everybody believed this. We know from Josephus that when Pompey, the Roman general, seized the temple the first time, when they didn't destroy it, they just captured it, he went to the high priest and he says, where's that golden statue? He wants the gold. And he was going to kill the high priest because the guy said, we don't have such a thing, it's not true. Until he finally convinced him that it was a legend. But everybody knows that the Jews have a statue of a donkey because that's how they got out of Egypt. The donkey found the water. While in contempt of Jupiter Hammon, they sacrifice a ram, or what we call the carbon Pesach. In other words, you take the animal which is worshipped in Egypt and they sacrifice it. These Jews abstain from the flesh of swine. Why did he do that? A Roman would really be bothered. Why don't you eat pork? Well, the answer is obvious. From the recollection of that loathsome affliction which they formerly suffered from leprosy, to which the pig is subject. So every time they look at a pig, they think about dirt, and they think about their ignoble origins and how dirty they were, which caused them to be kicked out of Egypt in the first place. The famine with which they were for a long time distressed is still commemorated by frequent fastings. A Roman couldn't understand Yom Kippur, let alone Tisha B'Av and this other thing. Why would you have a whole day where you can't eat? It doesn't make any sense. It must be that they're thinking this, they're reliving the old days when as slaves in Egypt or in the desert, they constantly fasted. And the Jewish bread made without corn, without leaven, which you and I know as matzah, is a standing evidence to their seizure of corn. In other words, they used to steal, when they were slaves, wheat, because that's what slaves do, if you don't watch them. And it had to be real fast. When you're stealing bread, you want to make it as quickly as possible. You don't have time to leaven. And there's your matzah. There's a new spin. They say that they instituted a rest on the 7th day because that brought them rest from their toils. But then, I like this, charmed with the pleasures of idleness, the 7th year also was devoted to sloth. They couldn't understand the concept of Shemitah, that farmers would spend the whole year not working unless the Jews are addicted to idleness and laziness. He has a little more to say. These rituals and ceremonies, howsoever introduced, have the support of antiquity. These go way back when, and to a Roman like Tacitus, anything that's old is legitimate. But the other Jewish institutions, which have been extensively adopted, a lot of people out there who aren't Jewish are picking this up, are tainted with execrable knavery. In other words, they're just disgusting. For the scum and refuse of other nations, renouncing the religion of their country, were in the habit of bringing gifts and offerings to Jerusalem, hence the wealth and grandeur of the state. People are going for this cult, these Jewish missionaries, where they're abandoning their family, and they're stopping being normal, and they're not eating pork, and they're spending whole days in idleness, and who knows whatever else they're doing. It's a cult. And this is disgusting, and the scum and refuse of the other nations. In other words, any Roman or any Greek that would subscribe to this is scum, okay, by definition. And also, because faith is inviolably observed and compassion is cheerily shown to one another, while the bitterest animosity is against all others. Meaning these Jews are too clannish, and they hang out with each other too much. They eat and lodge with each other only, and though a people of unbridled lust, they admit no intercourse with women from other nations, which he cannot understand. Among themselves no restraints are imposed. And that they might be known by a distinctive mark, they have established the practice of circumcision. All who embrace their faith must submit to the same operation. To a Roman and a Greek, circumcision, as is being debated in San Francisco today, if you follow the news, is a barbaric ritual. You couldn't understand that at all. And so what can we do? These Jews come from an ignoble background. They were, as I say before, nothing but trouble from day one. Pharaoh was right to kick them out. They attract the lowest elements out there to their faith and their culture. The first thing instilled into their converts is to despise the gods, to abjure their country, and to set at naught parents, children, and brothers. You hear this even today. They show concern for the increase of their own population, and so on and so on and so forth. I don't need to say much more about this. You get the idea. This guy, he subscribes to that version of Passover. Well, that's the way he heard it. And he's educated. He's a senator. He's got a better education than most people. He's one of the elite of the Roman Empire. The officials and the intellectuals who inhabit the East, many of them, they identify with the other version of the story. And that the Torah's version of the story is obviously a Jewish lie to sort of self-justify. But educated people know the real truth. And it's just very interesting that at the same time, the Jews are developing these set of ceremonies called a Seder, in which they say every Jewish family has to make everyone in the family be there, and you tell our story. Because what they're saying about us is a lie. And we even want the wicked son at the Seder, don't we? As you all know. Because whether he likes here or not, let him hear our story. Don't let him buy into the other story, because otherwise, we've really lost it. And it's going to be 4 cups, it's going to be 4 questions, it's going to be all the other rituals. And the Jews, as you know, evolve a very powerful ritual, the Seder, which is, till this very day, the most widely accepted of all Jewish rituals. I'm sure you know from surveys and other things that if there's any ceremony that most Jews still adhere to, it's the Passover Seder of one type or another. If there's any ceremony which has captured the imagination of people who are not Jewish around the world, it's the Passover Seder. President Obama is not interested in shaking a lulav, but he does come to a Seder, as did President Bush and Reagan and Carter and Ford. I remember this. And Bill Clinton, of course. And it's interesting. Like I said, they're not coming there to fast on Yom Kippur. They're not coming there to spend all night learning on Shavuos in the White House. But they are having a Passover Seder because they can understand the universal themes with which it's associated. And there's just something about the way they put it together with the wine and the matzah and the maror that draws people from such a wide variety of backgrounds. It's just really interesting. Whoever came up with this really came up with a powerful anti-Egyptian narrative set of ceremonies that worked. I mean, look, here we are thousands of years later, and everybody here knows what I'm talking about. You can't say that about too many religious institutions and ceremonies. Okay? Now, let me say that the rabbis in the Talmud are very familiar with the Manetho version and the Tacitus version. Those who know the Medrash on the book of Esther will know, and some have studied this with me in other places, that when Haman sends out his letters to kill the Jews, in the story of the book of Esther, he prefaces it with a whole account of how bad the Jews are. Look what they did to poor Pharaoh. Let me see if I can give you a short version of this. And you'll hear an interesting argument. It's always good to hear the other side. Yeah, here you go. This is in the Midrash what Pharaoh said, that from the beginning of time the Jews have been ungrateful, as witness their behavior towards Pharaoh. With kindness he received them and their wives and children at a time of famine. It's true. He gave them the best of his land. That's what it says in the Bible. He provided them with food and all they needed. And then Pharaoh decided to build a palace, and he requested the Jews do a little bit of work for him. They began to work grudgingly and been murmuring, and it's not completed until this day. Right? They immediately wanted a union and a lunch hour and all that. In the midst of it, they approached Pharaoh and they said, we want to go and worship God. We need a 3 days journey. We petitioned, lend us, by the way, give us some gold and silver and things while we go away for 3 days. So much that they borrowed, each one took 90 donkeys out of Egypt with them. Egypt was emptied out. And then they didn't return after 3 days, so naturally Pharaoh went to get his money back. And they had some guy named Moses, who was an arch wizard, who was bred in the house of Pharaoh, and he drowned him in the sea, and look what ingrate he was. Okay? This is in a Jewish text. You can spin it that way if that's what you wish. And that's how many people in the classical world, the Greco world, understood the reality of the story of Pesach, of Passover. Okay? Now, what happened? Here's a fascinating example of the law of unintended consequences that I always like to refer to. The period that I'm speaking about, the 200s BC to 100 BC and all that, is called the Hellenistic era. And it was characterized by all sorts of phenomena, especially religious and cultural phenomena. The Greek or Macedonian rulers had conquered a gigantic area and tried to spread the Greek culture of one sort or another over a huge, vast area where there were already existing, long-rooted native cultures. The best example of that, but not the only one, would be Egypt. You don't need me to tell you the Egyptians were around a long time before Alexander came along. And so the pharaohs and all the famous culture, the pyramids, the hieroglyphics and all that, long, thousands of years. But then the Greeks took over, and they imposed, or they, through impressing everybody, it captured the imagination of the peoples of that era, and they gave up their religions and adopted the Greek ones. It's really interesting. That's why it's called the era of Hellenization. Only the Jews did not change their religion, but the Jews changed a lot of their culture. The Jews Hellenized culturally, but they didn't switch their religion, although some came close. We call this episode Hanukkah, but it wasn't an easy matter. But there was a great deal of cultural Hellenization among the Jews. I always like to bring the example that the leading rabbi of this era was named Antigonus Ishocho. Antigonus is not a Jewish name. One would not imagine Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, Rabbi Harold or Mark Feinstein. It's interesting that the Hellenistic culture did penetrate quite interestingly into the Jewish culture. The Talmud says that the practice was that on Saturday morning you read the Torah from a scroll in the Ark written in Greek, not in Hebrew. I repeat, it's not that they read it in Hebrew and translated it into Greek. That happens some places also. But the Torah itself was written and read in Greek. But one could not imagine, it's in Megillah, one could not imagine this today to have an English Torah, but they did it once upon a time because, as the Talmud tells us, Greek is particularly beautiful. Yafta Elohim Yefes, it's Yafeh. Okay? It's just interesting. And you see there was extensive cultural penetration among the Jews, but they did not switch their religion for a variety of reasons. But the Greek religions went through a crisis of confidence during these centuries. This is well known. Lots of people began to disbelieve in it. And what had worked in the old Greece when there were small city-states, before Alexander came along, that Athens believes in the god of Athena and Sparta and this and the other, it worked for them in that context, but it didn't work so well for the masses of people elsewhere. And so there came a breakdown of religion. And history teaches us that when there's a breakdown of religion, it's not replaced usually by atheism, but it's replaced by cults, by extreme ideas. Okay? Religion is sort of defined as kind of normal. We know about sin. We know nobody's perfect. We keep pushing people to try to be better. But we all know people stumble, and we can work around that. In a cult, if you don't listen to the rules, you get killed or something like that, right? There are drastic consequences. And this was a characteristic of this period in history. And so, the best example is Egypt. I mentioned before, if you want an example of what I'm talking about, the priest Manetho, who wrote this famous and controversial history book, an account of the events of the Exodus of Egypt. Manetho was the high priest of Serapis. Serapis is a combination of gods. You see, to the Greeks, the idea of worshiping an animal and an animal build was like retrograde, primitive, weird. On the other hand, to Egyptians, that is what gods look like. As you know, I'm sure, a Greek god is human. In the time when the Greeks are ruling Egypt, the Macedonians, Manetho and Ptolemy II, they create a new cult called Serapis, body of a man, head of an animal. Get it? And this is syncretism. You mesh together existing Greek ideas with long-lasting old Egyptian ones. And you try to make a cholent, as we say in Yiddish, to make everybody happy. It's a period, in other words, a lot of borrowing back and forth. This is the period when all kinds of interesting religious phenomena take place. The one which is the longest lasting and the most important of the religious phenomena which pop up during these centuries, we call Christianity. Historically studied, it of course emerges in the first century and has elements of Judaism, elements of Hellenistic beliefs, paganism, elements of Egyptian paganism. As a matter of fact, very strong elements that we trace back to the Egyptian side. Just to give you a short little example of this, from Egypt came the notion of the trinities of divine powers, which was innate in the ancient Egyptian religion. The mystical connection of Isis, Osiris, and Horus is a prototype of a vast development of Hellenistic theology. Egypt is the homeland of materialistic theology, where God's a material form, of the notions of the Immaculate Conception, the divine incarnation, the various chambers of the afterworld, and Hellenistic theology is marked by a gradual surrender of Greek to Egyptian thought. There's a lot more than that. It is out of Egypt that we have the idea of eating God's body and drinking the blood. It is originally out of Egypt that we have the idea of monasticism of various types. Now, they go through a lot of development. I'm collapsing a lot into a few minutes, but nevertheless, you see the combination of long-standing Greek ideas over a course of several centuries with very powerful Egyptian notions which mesh together. And eventually, in the first century, they actually meshed together with Jewish ideas as well. And out of the whole thing comes the early Christianity, which the Christians fought over for quite a while to get exact definition of what they believe in. There's a Nicene Creed. There are many other forms of Christianity. The Christians themselves preserve records of what they call the various heresies, in which there were many different groups which had different ideas, radically different ideas about the nature of God, the nature of this, that, and the other. You name it. And they were pretty violent over it. And the form of Christianity we have today kind of evolved through politics and through other ways, and obviously caught the imagination of millions of people. But that's a fact. It spoke to them, but nevertheless has all kinds of elements in it if you study this historically. Egypt was the great center of anti-Semitism, as I told you before. The early elements of Egyptian culture which penetrated in Christianity are accompanied by anti-Semitism, or anti-Judaism to be more exact. The current term is Judeophobia. And there's a book by Professor Schaeffer. And those elements in early Christianity, very anti-Judaic, as the Jews at that time were very anti-Christian, have their real source in terms of their passion in Egypt. A lot of these ideas that I just mentioned, the Immaculate Conception, the Trinities, and all the rest of it, are accompanied with powerful notions that the Jewish stuff is bad and stubborn and narrow-minded and ethnocentric, and selfish and lying and all that sort of business. And out of all that emerges the triumph of Christianity, because that's what happens. Over the course of the 1, 2, and 300s, the Christian faith spread and spread, in spite of persecutions. This is a fact. And eventually, as I'm sure many remember from school, the Emperor Constantine in the early 300s, the Roman Emperor, adopts Christianity as his personal religion, and before long it's the official religion of the Roman Empire, and the other religions are done away with, they're suppressed. And he has whole councils, Council of Nicaea, to decide what exactly is the official doctrine and theology, but they hammer it out. Okay? What's really interesting then is that this new religion, Christianity, which has such a heavy element of ancient Egyptian culture, and it, as I just indicated it does, eventually constitutes itself as a form of Judaism, because that's what Christianity is. It actually argues that it is the true Judaism, and that our Judaism is wrong. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means that if you're an Egyptian living in the 200-300s, you can cuss out the Jews all you want. You can subscribe to all the kinds of descriptions that we said before. You can regard old-fashioned Judaism, as I say, being a narrow and retrograde in every respect. But you got to buy the Jewish narrative, because you got to believe in the Old Testament. You got to buy the story of Moses and Pharaoh as we tell the Passover story. You have to surrender the Manetho account. You have to, in its place, pick up the Bible account. Now, you can, and they do, reinterpret it, and so Moses may come out to be the first Christian, and Pharaoh may be representing, old Judaism or something like that. You can play those games, and they certainly do, because after all, give a clergyman, a rabbi, or anybody a chance that they can mold anything into anything. But nevertheless, you have to buy into that account. The new religion does many things to the Jews, but one of the things it does is spread the Jewish story around the world. Christian missionaries, not Jewish, go to the four corners of the earth, as you and I know. And as a result of their efforts, the story of the Bible, including the very powerful story of Passover, the very powerful story of these slaves who had no hope and were stuck in Egypt and all the rest of it, and then Moses comes along and God says, I'm going to get them out of there, and all the story down to the crossing of the Red Sea and the drowning of Pharaoh's army are known in Africa and Asia, everywhere, thanks to the medium of Christianity. And that's not the only story that they pick up, but it's one of the very powerful stories. And as I say before, it resonates with people around the world. So much so that the triumph of Christianity meant the death of the old Egyptian narrative. Even though, ironically, the triumph of Christianity was propelled, especially in the ideational sense, very much by Egyptian ideas. But in order to get that going, you had to pay the price. You had to become a Christian. And if you're a Christian, then you're a kind of a Jew. That's how they define themselves. And therefore, you can have a different take on the Jewish story, but it's going to be the Jewish story. And as a result of that kind of ironic or interesting or piquant episode, everybody's heard of our tale. Nobody, until tonight, has heard of theirs, even though it's out, and these are books that are out for a long, long time. But it got buried in oblivion, pretty much, except for scholars and ancient historians and things like that, not because of anything we did. Although we still do keep up the old form of the old fight. We still every year have a Passover Seder. You still have the retelling of the story. And the enemy is dead, but we keep fighting anyway. I might be wrong. Listen to this. I'm reading from the foreword from 2003. Egyptian scholar planning lawsuit over Exodus gold. A prominent Egyptian legal scholar is preparing a lawsuit against Jews around the world over gold allegedly stolen in biblical times during the Jewish exodus from Egypt. This is not a fool. This is Nabil Hilmi, Dean of the Faculty of Law at Egypt's so-and-so university. Announced this plan in the Egyptian Government Weekly, according to the Middle East Bureau, et cetera, and he's going after the Jew. He planned to launch a lawsuit. And this is the president of a law school. And he's got a Facebook, too. I saw it yesterday. And Nabil Hilmi. And he called the Hilmi told Ahal Aram, this is the New York Times of Egypt, that if the story of Exodus is to be believed, Jews fleeing from Egypt stole from pharaonic Egypt gold, jewelry, cooking utensils, silver ornaments, clothing, and more, leaving Egypt in the middle of the night with all this wealth, which today is priceless. Calling this alleged heist the greatest fraud history has ever known, Hilmi said that he and a number of Egyptian jurists plan to sue the Jews around the world for these lost treasures, the value of which he figures in the trillions of dollars. And he goes on to, if you want to see it, you can. I'll show it to you later on. Anybody can take a look at it if they wish. What's really cool is that he's serious about this. He's preparing a whole legal team back in 2003. And Dershowitz says, make my day. Bring it on. Well, listen to this. Hilmi did not specify where he planned to file the suit, but should the case ever reach a courtroom, Alan Dershowitz, a Harvard law professor, told the forward, "I'd be happy to defend the Jews." This would be quite a scene. And I want to tell you something. I couldn't find the exact place, but I remember seeing this years ago. The reason this never came to court was because the Egyptian authorities told this guy, "Do not bring this lawsuit." And the reason is because if you do, you will be acknowledging the Jewish narrative, and you will be saying that the current state of Israel are the same Jews from long ago. And one of the key arguments in the Arab platform is, I'm sure you know this, the current Jews have nothing to do with the ancient people of Israel once upon a time. They're Europeans or something else that stole the land, and they'd rather forego a claim of $1 trillion than say that there's any validity whatsoever to the Jewish narrative, which speaks volumes. I will conclude tonight with a second article that appeared 1 week later in the foreword, which gives a little hope for the future, called "A Muslim Defense of Jews on Trial" by a guy named Hesham Hassabala. And he writes as follows: "I thought the class action obesity lawsuit against McDonald's was the silliest thing in the world to hit a courtroom until I read about an Egyptian scholar's plan to take on the Jewish people to court for an alleged crime committed millennia ago." And he goes on to describe all this. And he says, "I read that Dershowitz said I'd be happy to defend the Jews." Well, this guy says, "So would I, and I'm not a lawyer and I'm not Jewish." A Muslim defender of the Jews? Absolutely. Do not be surprised, for Moses, you see, figures prominently in Muslim belief. He's one of the 5 mightiest messengers of God, along with Noah, Abraham, and some others. The Koran says that God bestowed his grace on Moses and Aaron. He was specially chosen by God, and God bestowed on him wisdom and knowledge as a reward for doing good. In addition, the book of Moses is described by the Quran, notice the Chumash as we call it, as a light and a guide. At least 73 Quranic passages, many of them encompassing several verses, talk of Moses. And in fact, there are more verses about Moses in the Quran than about Muhammad. The Quran tells of 2 miracles: Moses' staff turning into a serpent and his hand glowing when he placed it under his arm, that God permitted as proof of his prophethood. It details the plagues that were unleashed on the Egypt for their refusal to believe in God and set the Hebrews free. My favorite part of the story, the splitting of the Red Sea, is mentioned twice, at least in the Quran. The entire Exodus story, for me, is a happy one. It is a tale of bitter bondage and hardship and the glory of God's deliverance from that hardship. And this guy's a Muslim, but once again, he finds meaningful and he identifies with this story just on the Torah Shebiksav, just on the plain level. I was so intrigued by the whole idea of the lawsuit over the Exodus that I did some research. The good Egyptian scholar might be surprised to learn that the Quran does not mention any reference to the Hebrews taking gold and silver out of Egypt. And it goes on. And again, if anybody's interested, this is all online. And if you want to, you can read the articles over here. And so I end on that note because we're all looking for a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. The battle over Israel's legitimacy today is the big one, as Ellen was mentioning before. It's the same kind of thing again. People tell big lies. And once again, I'm sorry to say, many of the intellectuals of the world, the Tacituses of today, the movers and shakers, professors, writers, media people, buy into the counter-narrative, no matter how it is, because they're really motivated by who knows what. The happy story that we end with is, here we are today. Our traditions, symbolized most powerfully by the Seder of Pesach, by the Passover Seder, shows us that we stick to our guns, and they will be forced to change through thoroughly unexpected reasons. Some of our greatest enemies may turn out to be, ironically, our defenders, whether they desire it or not. And it goes to show us, however, that if I talk about a battle over whose truth, this is not something that only happened 2,500 years ago, but it's almost a definitional aspect of being a Jew. Abraham was called the guy on the other side, Avram HaIvri. He was on the other side of the world, meaning he did not conform. If you ask Nimrod what's the story with Abraham, he could give you a different account than we would. We maintain the integrity of our story, and that's how we survive. I hope everyone will have, as they say, a Chag Kosher V'Samech, a happy Passover, and when you are at your Seder, you're striking a blow. Good night.